Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Ankur Patel, and today I have a very special guest with us, George Yuhasz, who's the VP of Global Analytics and Solution at Fresenius. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So, George, we always love to kick off the podcast with really the journey that you've been on. So, if you maybe could walk us through how you got to doing what you're doing today, we would love that.
Absolutely. And I like to tell people that it was by no means a intentional or self or a planned journey. It was very much a case of finding the need and filling it over time. In college, I was a theater guy, and I also happened to do a lot of plays and participate in a lot of productions. And I thought that it would be good to have a quote unquote safe major, which I also chose psychology, which you could argue is that a safe major or not, but I was interested in the topic. And as a result, had to take a statistics class. And all my fellow psychology majors were like, "Oh, it's horrible. You're going to hate it." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And I was worried about it. And then when I got to the class and ended up taking it, I really enjoyed it. And that stayed with me. And so after, I'll say, a very brief career as a professional theater guy after college, I said, okay, well, I'm going to look at doing other things because I feel like if I'm going to work this hard, I should make a better living. And ended up going back to grad school and getting one of my first jobs as leading a research unit for Penn State University, particularly in the demographics as a Census Bureau affiliate. And that led to the starting point of being entrepreneurial with data analytics and building data analytics products. And I've been doing that since then for healthcare payers, for large banks, for large manufacturers, and then did a pivot into helping startups grow, and then continuing to do this for large organizations. And as the theme developed from data to business intelligence to decision support to analytics to data science to big data, you name it, stayed current and stayed ahead of the topic to keep trying to innovate and find value where I can.
That makes sense. I think riding that wave, right, which is still playing out, and
Yeah.
there's a lot more to go. It makes sense. I think you've kind of done a really incredible pivot in many ways, and I think that it should be inspirational for a lot of the people in the audience that are looking to try to go and adapt to the kind of the next curve, right, next wave in that life cycle, the technological life cycle, which is AI now, and I'm sure more to come in the future. And then, what do you do at Fresenius today?
So today I am within the global technology organization, and I am responsible for the the global delivery of analytics products and solutions. And what that means is we're within the data and analytics COE, and I report to the global head of all data and analytics within the technology organization. And we're the largest entity in the kidney care space from a clinic operations and a manufacturing side. So we touch a lot of areas across the healthcare delivery side as well as the medical device side. So my I have teams across the globe, and the kind of products we build range from very traditional analytics and reporting solutions to some of the very cutting edge types where we're really seeing where we can push the envelope to innovate our operations and provide better health outcomes.
That's a great overview. I really appreciate that. And I think that's a massive challenge what you've just described there, which is running such a large global operation and then the variety of stakeholders that you'd have to interface with to be successful, right? Technical stakeholders, business stakeholders, just being two of several. How should more business leaders and operators think about working with stakeholders that have different almost frames. Like the way that their
Yeah.
brains work is very different, right? Different things that motivate them.
Yes.
They have different hopes, desires, and dreams and fears. How do you work with such different varied stakeholders, kind of help them move in the same direction?
It's such an important question, and I think there's two sides to it. I think you have to start with meeting someone where they are, regardless of the level of the stakeholder you're dealing with. It's being responsible to build your own toolbox of credibility, experience, depth, so that you're familiar with a number of scenarios and means of solving problems, while also being empathetic and sympathetic to the stakeholder you're working with, so that you can meet them on their terms. Because as you said, everyone's different. Everyone's got a different point of view, whether it's um, technical, business savvy, cultural. All of those things play into how you connect as human beings, and then join forces to solve problems. And that has to be the guiding principle. And so you have to carry your weight in doing that. And part of that is being well-rounded and responsive, and educating yourself, and then being empathetic and sympathetic to meet someone else on their terms.
Yeah, and I imagine you have to talk about the same thing in different ways. So, like Gen AI, for
Yeah.
example, the opportunity and the challenge that it poses. If you talk to a technical audience, you have to speak the same language that they are familiar with, right? Kind
Yeah.
of meet them on their wavelength, and then business operators as well. You might be talking about the same thing to both
Yes.
audiences, but the language is quite.
It absolutely is. And I think about, there's really three pillars within the space that you can kind of have as your starting point. Are you talking about a technology, which could mean a capability or an infrastructure, an ecosystem? Are you talking about a process, which might mean a workflow, a service, how people come together, a bureaucracy, a corporation? Or are you talking about an experience, which is usually very personalized and something that you want to be something that is either unique to the person or a shared experience that you're trying to make simpatico and similar? So if you're looking across those three dimensions, then you can kind of have a matrix by which you make it real and specific, but also
Mhm.
cover a lot of bases.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's using and adopting language to kind of speak to
Yeah,
those audiences. So
yeah,
could we maybe talk about, the big inflection point like this happens? Obviously, you've seen several over the course of your career, but Gen AI happens, right? And by
yep,
happen, I mean it becomes top of mind for your organization and other organizations. And a lot of people pinpoint this as like November 2022 with the advent of ChatGPT, maybe a couple of months in, right? It kind of really become it's barbershop topic, it's coffee shop topic,
yeah.
it's everywhere. Business leaders that were maybe in the shadows around some of this, like they're coming out and they're asking about it and they want their hands on it. How do you, as an organization and as a business leader, think about introducing this technology? Where does the conversation start? How has that matured today to where it is?
And this is the funny thing where I think you have to start from the perspective that there are two universally acceptable truths that seem like they conflict, which is everything has changed and nothing has changed. So
Mm-hmm.
where everything has changed, you have a way in or a way to approach the topic of AI that is much more accessible, much more democratized, and pervasive than you ever did before. Previously was kind of in the domain of scientists and roboticists and other high-end scholars and engineers. And now it is anyone can go sign into the large language model service that they
Yeah.
prefer, or many technology providers or vendors, or now even websites with personalized assistants have moved beyond the idea of a simple chat service. It is now pervasive. So that's the where everything has changed. Where nothing has changed is you still need to apply the standards and the
Mm-hmm.
rigor to ensure that something works for you from both the design perspective in terms of is it doing what it's intended to do, and then managing risk to your organization from the types of exposure and utilization that can have adverse effects, while also looking at, okay, how do we capitalize on it for real, beyond the talk, beyond the hype, and then making sure that you're enabling experiments and experiences with the right guardrails in place to accelerate and find the value where you can.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the net new thing is the technology itself, but how you take that technology, how
Yeah.
you adopt it, what ringers you put the technology through, it's the same as ever before, right? And that's why I think when people think about the adoption cycle of Gen AI in consumer versus in a regulated space like you're in, it's very different. In
Yeah.
consumer, you could have it adopted within a day or two. It's just released as a feature, new experience. The stakes aren't super high. Everyone wants to get their hand on it. They hands on it. They play around with it. In a regulated space, it's the entire opposite. You're going to go through checks and checks and checks, make sure there it's adding value. You start with baby steps as you go. It's long and drawn out. Everything down to like which models are acceptable for the teams to play around with
Yeah.
and use. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Yeah.
and what guardrails do you have? Is it for internal use? Right, and then how do you govern that? And then if you make it available for external use, how do you kind of handle that piece that's being unlocked? And I think the surprising bit is that adoption is still very, very early on, right? There's so much to go. And I'm curious, like, as you're helping navigate your teams through the use of this technology, where are you seeing actual traction in terms of usage and adoption? Whereas, like, what are areas that you think that, or maybe you were hopeful would have gotten some adoption that perhaps hasn't, perhaps because of the complexity around the regulatory, legal, and compliance side of things, or maybe it was just an
Yeah.
underwhelming experience and therefore there hasn't been quite enough adoption.
I think that so I think that where we anticipated there being a lot of, and maybe not resistance, but a lot of ground to cover in terms of ensuring that the right discussions were happening across different types of risk, legal, security types of review. We anticipated that, and so that's part of what we're digging into to make sure that we cover the full scope. I think where we were both surprised was for what could be considered a safe experiment, what could be considered non-controversial in
Mm-hmm.
terms of types of information that you can either ask from having a personalized assistant the way that a large language model can provide you, as well as how you can start to prototype, if not quickly deploy solutions. And what does that bubble look like? I think we were surprised that one, how quickly we could move, as you kind of called out on the consumer digital
Yeah.
side, how quickly we can move when those barriers are removed. But then also, then there's a bit of the education side of, okay, from technologist perspective, this is really cool. I'm so glad we can do this. From the user adoption side, making sure it's sort of feature forward and experience first. Otherwise, you're still stuck answering the so what, why
Yeah.
should I care question, right? And that was also not really surprising, but surprised to the degree at which I'll say some populations, I don't see how it helps me. So you almost have to really think about what is that breadcrumb trail that's incentivizing, and then who are you incentivizing? If it's in any case when you're looking to improve efficiencies, are there reasons why those perceived non-efficiencies are there that are actually good? And then the other side of it is who is measuring the efficiency improvement and who's benefiting? Are those forces all working together and in alignment? And it's comes back to a cultural thing where you might have an assumption once, like any good scientist, once you conduct the experiment and the data proves or disproves your hypothesis, you have to adapt and learn from it, right? And that was the other part that I think was a change and a recalibration, but it was a good one.
Yeah, that's I think that's a very interesting kind of frame, which is the technologists want to get their hands on new technology because it's shiny and splashy. But then when you actually think about the implementation in production and in business, it's what value is it adding? How does it add value? And there is some skepticism, right? I think skepticism builds over time when what you thought would transpire maybe hasn't transpired on the time frame that you had originally expected, and then you're questioning and you're a little more skeptical, and I think winning the skeptics over that's the real challenge. Winning the enthusiasts over that's easy, like
Yeah.
they're already game to go from the very beginning, but the skeptics, the holdouts, that's where like rubber hits the road, right? That's the big challenge there. I'm curious in terms of how you're thinking about coordinating your teams to go use this technology, right? Use the generative AI in the different areas. How do you think about choosing the appropriate areas of the business, maybe particular workflows where you think that this could be helpful? How do you go through that exercise? Because I think the challenge that we see a lot of organizations struggling with is picking the right lanes to go and focus on because
Hmm.
they're not sure where they should start thinking about adapting this technology.
I mean, it's, I almost, and I think this is where having good product management methodologies and good discipline about um, understanding capabilities, forming hypotheses, being able to rapidly test and then using some type of definition like value statement or metrics to prove or disprove those assumptions. I think that discipline serves you very well here. I think the challenge is going to be teams that take the approach of I have a solution now, let me go find a problem, right? And I think in any circumstance that's going to be hard. Not all, because sometimes with this kind of capability you can just sweep up a lot of things and now start to use it to deliver faster than you could. But I would say anything that requires rigor, multiple parties to come together, and strong alignment on purpose and data and empirical definitions of what success criteria are, then if you have those muscles developed and you have those processes in place, you're going to have a lot smoother ride with this, barring the constraints we already discussed, right, around more stringent risk and regulatory criteria. But in terms of ease of adoption and ease of proof, if you have the framework already in place, you can accelerate this. And what this does is accelerate other types of work and
Mhm.
workflows that weren't thought of. And I think to the other part of your question then is, how do you frame the story of what's now possible that wasn't before in a way that people get traction to,
Yeah,
right? And that's as much the literacy and cultural change management side.
I couldn't agree more with that. I think that's exactly right. It's framing this is their current state. This is how things are done today.
Yeah.
With this technology, this is the expectation that we have, right? This is what we expected that future state to look like. And then you could de-risk it by figuring out a small scale experiment, a proof of concept internally even, around applying that technology, seeing if you see early signs of that expected ROI, right? And kind of going through that
Yeah.
calculus. And then
Yep.
if you do see early signs that are indicative of what you thought the future state would look like, you invest more. If you don't see it, you kind of come back to the drawing board and figure out, hey, did maybe the application of the technology was improper? Maybe you just picked the wrong process or wrong area of the business to really focus this effort in. But it allows you to kind of go and iterate as you go, right? And I think maybe drawing that analogy out of when you think about who you need to win over to go and like really mobilize a small team, both on the business side, on the IT side, on the ML data side of things. How do you go about coordinating that effort today, winning the multiple stakeholders over, so you could very clearly, with urgency and priority, move forward in a particular direction?
There's I'm gonna say two sides to that stakeholder engagement coin that I try and focus on, and that there's nuances to it, even so. But the two main sides are going to be one is um, how are you demonstrating credibility of message and clarity of the story, and why should they care what's in it for them? And then the other side of it is how are you offering up the way in, the lanes for them to partner, the lanes for them to be leaders with you. Because I think sometimes this is offered up as a solution and now it's, okay, you're going to do Gen AI, right? And people aren't even there. They're not even, wait, what do you mean I'm doing AI? You almost, and then others are like, I want to do Gen AI. And you're like, why? What are you trying to do?
Yeah.
And so somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, you need to be able to have that clarity of purpose and message that says, this is where we are. Here's what I'm offering. Here's what I understand. And this is individual, person to person or team to team. This is what I understand your goals and objectives to be based on our research or based on our point of view. Here's where we think we can drive value with this opportunity. And it's an opportunity. But this doesn't get realized unless each of us agree to it and each of us get skin in the game and participate in realizing it. And you have to almost lever it that way. Even if they're coming to you and I want Gen AI. Why? How do we align? How do we get common purpose of message? And then you craft what the roles and responsibilities look like. And even if it's just, okay, now we have a service, we're just going to enable you, but you still have to come back and show us your value case with proof, right? Sometimes that's a place you get to. I would say even that stance is a rapid evolution forward for areas that are controlled and have a tight, rigorous ship so that you have a way to enable by removing guardrails, but minimizing or removing obstacles, but minimizing risk of non-compliance, security breaches, you name it,
Sure.
right? But at the end of the day, messaging and then stance, you have to have credibility with both.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think that's right. I think earmarking what the value is that you're looking for, that you're trying to accomplish, and then make sure that you're always tracking towards that. Because I think it's so easy for both internal teams and external vendors to get caught up in the flashiness of the new technology. But if it's not applied to the right
Yeah.
problem set, and you don't have like the discipline to track the actual impact that it's having or likely to have, and you see kind of a path forward for this to actually be helpful to users in production and to the business at large, you sometimes get lost in technology for technology's sake, right? And that's a very, very tricky and difficult place to get stuck. How do you think about whether you solve for a problem with internal resources, so internal teams, versus going and trying to find either a software solution to use or a software vendor to use or a consulting firm to use? I'm just curious how you go about the planning process, because I imagine some make sense to go and do in-house, some might be better off by having external partners, some might be a combination of the two. What sort of framework do you use to make those decisions?
Yeah, and it's there is no kind of one size fits all methodology for that either, I would say, where depending on the uh, the goal you have, whether it's new technology experimentation, adoption, and enablement, your options are pretty much you either, upskill your own folks and have them go learn and then have some level of empirical test to say, yeah, okay, we're in fact moving in this direction. Having vendor partners you trust and have a relationship with that have credibly done something like this before and can offer you a way into it, or doing a bit of a discovery in terms of who are the new and exciting candidates out there that we need to talk about onboarding. I think the reality is many organizations that are of a large enough size, it can get harder and harder for them to onboard new folks. So sometimes they can be at the mercy of, well, here's who we are able to work with quickly, and so we'll see what we can do. And other times, depending on the type of organization, they're able to quickly identify and have a speed lane for new partners. So you get to constantly kind of audition and figure out if there's a fit for you to move something forward. I wish there was a one size fits all. I've never met one, but I think, some degree of upskilling your own folks and then finding external folks that you can partner together with to solve the problem is usually the right mix, particularly with new capabilities.
What's your advice for how to structure this in a way where you can kind of check progress um, along the way? So it's not a 12-month open-ended exercise, but it's very well
Yeah.
structured. Maybe let's start with that, because I have some questions around how you actually go and assign the team size and the budget. But I think maybe
Yeah.
scoping out the
Yeah.
timeline, how does that work today for you?
Well, it's almost always a let's pick a small, very contained scope and then figure out which pieces we're going to execute. And sometimes the inertia is towards small scope with new effort and it's very experimental. And then we're going to have to conduct it a few times, changing some variables so that we can control what the changes are and see what the differentials are between the experiments. Other times it's going to be rapid experimentation, what fails fast, what works and has traction we want to build on, and then iterate towards a single product that you're scaling along the way with each iteration, so that I'll say within a 6-month time frame, you minimally have some sort of working MVP that has very defined scope, but you've also set the thresholds both from a constraint and opportunity perspective on where you can scale it horizontally across, let's say, business units or business domains, or vertically in terms of the number of
Mhm.
adopters or the how deep you're going in the organization to accommodate within a set of domains. Um, that's the way I've learned to do it, and I say that I'm not saying it's the best way. I'm saying I've learned to do it that way because big bang anything I have an aversion to, and you can fall into the trap of endless POC, endless MVPs as well, and not really mature a capability much to be of service beyond very point and targeted users and adopters. So something that blends the two and starts with one and then iterates towards the other, even if you never quite get the big bang, but you can have big
Yep.
impact.
Yeah. So you're saying tight scope early on, right? And then find how does it scale
Yeah.
horizontally, vertically, right? Trying to find what that end state looks like and mapping towards it. Is that rigor in
Yeah.
place for internal teams as it is for external vendors? Because what I find, and I'm curious about this, is with external vendors, you're almost forced to, right? Because there's an external budget that you sometimes have to put together for a paid
Mhm.
POC or a paid pilot. Whereas with internal teams, maybe that a little bit of that discipline's lost because they are on payroll, they're internal to the org. You don't need to specify the start and end date and like think about it as like budget that is being spent internally. So I'm curious sort of how you think about external budget and planning versus internal.
It is a good question, and I think a lot of that depends on this the specific organization where the latitude you have with your full-time employees versus what your behavior patterns are for every new project you onboard a partner, right? I think what I will speak to is at organization, and I think this is more the trend these days, is that many organizations have very constrained IT budgets. And so whether you're an internal or external, I see a lot of the time, and this is, both my experience and that of my colleagues as we've reminisced about this, a lot of the time, even FTEs have to function with some degree of rigor regarding fixed scope because there's such a high demand for IT resources across many orgs that you need to be able to articulate where those resources are spending their time and how they're contributing to the bottom line one way or the other. And particularly when you're doing new endeavors and ones that, let's say, are early in their maturity, but also have potential transformative impact, there's going to be even more eyes on that. So even if it's internal, you're still going to have to be able to justify the time and resource expenditure because they could be doing something else to run an enhancement that's costing us money elsewhere, or to do an implementation to meet a new regulation on the other side of the world, right? Like those things always happen. So I would say the same rules apply for full-time employees, at least in my experience, as they do for contract partners, where you're marshaling external dollars to put towards that effort. The rigor now seems to be equally high on both.
In terms of use of Gen AI internally to help your team become more performant and productive, I'm curious what some of the common vendors in the software space that you use to help your team move more quickly. I mean, just to give you a couple of examples, you hear Claude or ChatGPT being used by teams to do research faster and find information. GitHub Copilot is a common one that comes up in our Microsoft's product.
Yep.
I'm curious if those or others are commonplace these days that you can't even imagine life without them because they've added so much value to the way you do business internally today.
I was just talking about this with a colleague, and I think, we have no real, we haven't done I'll say, the scientific measurement of this. So this is not purely data driven,
Mhm.
right? This is like but our hypothesis is that about half the folks are using some form of Gen AI day to day. But that doesn't mean it is a enterprise solution that they're using. It could be that they're using their own query methods off to the side and just saying, hey, how would I do this? Write me this thing, or what would this look like? And they're just kind of marshaling it as part of how they do things, right? The other half still I'll say, is a bit cautious, or has not yet been educated in terms of what this can mean for them. It's almost like the maybe the early days of the iPhone, where there was just some rapid adopters and it just became commonplace. And then there was a set of the population that just it was not part of their life having a smartphone. And then over time, more slices of that latter population started adopting it. It seems to be that now, if I was to give you my very off the cuff, unscientific opinion. And I say that because, particularly in highly regulated industries, as we talked about, the adoption of these types of solutions into the mainstream as part of the core offering is slower. So you don't see it as part of the normal tech stack. Instead, like people were using their smartphone early
Mhm.
on, whether they had it through work or not. I think you're seeing something similar for Gen AI services. And to put the final bullet on this point is that there's also heavy push to make sure people are educated that regardless of what you're doing on your own time, you cannot share, you cannot share proprietary information. Anything that's sensitive should never be put into any of these services. So we have a way of communicating. And again, this isn't me talking specific to my firm. This is me taking the approach of
Yep.
myself and my colleagues in the healthcare space that largely we're trying to make sure that the communication and doing our part to say, um, regardless of what formal communications have come out of security office or through other offices, you should never be putting these types of things through any kind of public service. So be careful how you leverage it. And then as we look to grow awareness of what products are being offered through our organizations, then we have the protections, we have the resiliency built in through those official products.
That's very interesting the way you describe it, which is what you do as an individual is very different than what you are allowed to do as part of a highly regulated industry, right? Within a highly regulated industry as an organization. So the adoption is going to be inherently slower, but you are going to see people clamor for XYZ to be available for use at work, right? In the worst cases,
Yep.
it's not sanctioned for use, but they go use it. Guarding against that is important. A common thing that we hear is that the vendors that have really great distribution already in organizations, so you can think of like Microsoft with their suite of products, they have
Mm-hmm.
distribution, they can introduce Gen AI capabilities super fast. And so generative AI, in some ways, could just be features on, for existing incumbent players that have distribution to introduce. And I'm very curious
Yes.
how you think about incumbents releasing generative AI features and whether
Yep.
that's usable or not, because you really lose some control when that happens because you don't know what models are behind the scenes, what the use of their data looks like. And maybe if it's a storied name, then they have a really good reputation around privacy. You trust them a bit more. But I'm very curious how you, as
Yep.
an organization or even within the broader industry, think about the use of generative AI features within existing software that you're using day in, day out.
It's on target what you're pointing out, right? Which is the reality is that service providers, whether they're cloud native providers like Amazon and Microsoft, are already including many features that are in the realm of generative AI or large language modeling, whether they're standalones, as you mentioned, Bedrock and OpenAI within Microsoft, or Gen AI services. What I would say is that at least the folks I'm talking to, we're trying to make every effort to take a stance of educating our stakeholders on these are what the platforms do by themselves historically that we've already used. Here's where the services that we've historically used are now starting to add, whether it's AI or Gen AI enriched features
Mhm.
that are different than what we've historically used and assumed to just be the same, even quote unquote, safe experience. And that while, to your point, we're trying to make sure that the partners that are already in and working with us to some degree already have presence, even the new services or new features, we're trying to make sure we vet. And again, speaking for myself and many of my colleagues across firms similar, we're trying to take the approach of how do we not completely halt innovation and enablement, but what do the guardrails look like so people are at least educated on the risks inherent in starting to adopt new features, new capabilities. And so there is many organizations are adopting, I'll say, a risk review framework that says these services are okay if implemented by these
Mhm.
teams with these guardrails. These services are not yet okay, are still under review, and communicating that. And in other cases, some firms are just locking them out
Yeah.
completely, so you can't even access them with your own devices through work. And I think that's a spectrum that is variable based on the specific, either if it's centralized or decentralized. If it's centralized, many efforts I think are being made to funnel the demand and funnel the policy making and funnel the guardrails and the enablement point of view through a common channel so everyone sees the same stuff at the same time. And other organizations have decided that's not practical, and they're decentralized, and so this area is in charge of these constituents and this demand, and they make the policy. It still has to roll up to the overall corporate policy and the overall security policies, but each gets to craft it for their domain. I've seen that too, right? And I don't think anyone at this point is saying that one is better than the other. I think what a lot of organizations are trying to do is what's right for us, and then how do we make sure we're transparent and very open about the choices we're making and what it means to everybody that's impacted by it. That's probably the best answer I can give because, again, in talking with my colleagues, I've seen such a degree of variability. There is no one size fits all, and that's true of the advisory firms too. And that they're kind of coming with the here's the spectrum of options, and figure out here's choices you can make and impacts that occur as a result.
It must be fascinating to be in legal or infosec right now because they have so much to do. That's such a big challenge, and
Yeah.
yet they have so much power because what they say and what they greenlight or don't greenlight impacts the rest of the organization. And what you're describing is exactly what we've seen and heard, which is different teams, different areas of the business have different policies depending on the sensitivity of the data that they have and frankly the sensitivity to a adverse outcome if it were realized, right? And so
Yeah.
they're trying to minimize the downside while leaving open obviously the upside, right? But really guarding against the downside.
Hmm.
It's much more about risk mitigation as much as it is about opportunity seeking, right? And I think in consumer it's different.
Yeah.
There isn't as much risk mitigation. It's pure hedonism in some ways. Like you're seeking opportunities as much as possible, right? You're not worried about the consequences because the
Yeah.
consequences aren't life or death. They're not dire in any
Right.
big way. Whereas like healthcare and finance and insurance, it impacts people's financial lives, which does have even health implications. So it's a much bigger risk on net versus some of the non-regulated industries. So definitely understand sort of where that comes from. I'm curious on the use of large language models, right? And the reason why I ask about this is
Yeah.
foundation models have gotten incredible amounts of funding. They have huge valuations. There are many foundation model players now. And there's this active, fierce debate that's happening on who ultimately wins, how many players can win, and is it the closed source
Hmm.
model players that win, like an OpenAI or an Anthropic, or are the open source model players going to win, like some of the open source models from Mistral or from Llama,
Yeah.
I mean, from Meta, from like Llama 2 to Llama 3 and such.
Yep.
And I'm very curious
Yep.
as an organization and as an industry where you see kind of the current temperature check. Is it around closed source model players like OpenAI, or are the open source models, even if they're a little bit behind technologically, because of the way that you could handle the governance around the use of that model and where that data goes, maybe perhaps they end up being the long-term winners?
It's a very legitimate question, and I do think that if I were to do a temperature check, I would equate it to a very similar argument about many of the particularly data engineering, data science, and analytical services that have been part of the open source versus closed source discussion for years, which is the trade-offs. You can potentially, and what types of trade-offs? If you are looking to minimize your investment in infrastructure and you have a trusted partner that then brings in, let's say, Anthropics or OpenAI through their channel, and contractually you're able to control what can and can't be done with anything that you're leveraging within that model, theoretically, you can accelerate and mitigate risk that way. Can you prove it? Do you have complete visibility into all the ins and outs? That's going to be harder, right? Whereas the more open source models that you can take, engineer, augment, completely box security
Mm-hmm.
protocols around, you have a lot more control. But as you say, maybe they don't perform as well. If you're already that strong of an engineering shop, who's to say you can't augment it yourself to
Yeah.
make it the best in the market, right? And that's where I think the interesting discussions and innovations are happening. Clearly, there's a lot of marketing around what the messaging is going to be. But I think it's so early on yet that I think it's going to be a bit of a sprint pulse type of activity where one sprints ahead and then the other sprints ahead. And we're not going to see we're not going to see a one way above all emerging as the clear winner. I think that there is enough attention and investment in this that many routes up the mountain will become apparent.
I think that's right. I think there's not one clear right answer. In fact, the best thing you could do as an organization is be flexible enough to some extent where if there is a net new improvement that one player has versus another, they're able to go and accommodate that new model that has been released by a major player into what you do. And oftentimes, like I think the leaderboards, when you look at these model foundation model players, you see the leaderboards, you see the scores, but when it comes down to your particular use case, your particular organization, the small differences in the leaderboard are irrelevant. Ultimately, it comes down to
Yeah.
how you use those models in the application layer that you're building out to serve your particular use case within the org. In fact, you could argue that you could use a slightly worse foundation model, but if the application layer is built out really well, it actually doesn't matter. You don't even need to be on the bleeding edge on the foundation model side because the application layer is built in such a great way that it's making do with maybe a less powerful model. And so you don't have to
Yeah.
worry about like an OpenAI releasing a GPT-5 and saying, wow, like all the work I've done with, let's say, Llama 3 is now obsolete because GPT-5 is so much better,
Right.
right? Um,
Or if you've abstracted it enough with that application tier, then you give yourself the ability to hedge and have multiple models sitting underneath it that serve up better and better outcomes and experiences without disrupting the end user's personalized journey to it, right? I mean, to me, that's always the when you think of good design principles, you want to limit the disruption to the end user and maximize the disruption to your ability to leapfrog ahead in the value you're bringing.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's how we think about this at Multimodal, which is we want to be foundation model agnostic to some extent. So we could swap in the model that is best to do a particular type of problem. And then be also just open to what our customers have greenlit. So if they only accept a Llama 3 or a certain Mistral model or Azure OpenAI, let's say that they're only comfortable with using that, it doesn't matter because we could swap those in and out. It's the application layer on top and the use of that data and how it's aligned to the particular workflow that we try to automate. It's all of that deep verticalized application layer that is the secret sauce that's essential. And you actually can swap in and out different foundation models over time, so the application layer takes advantage of the best possible engine, regardless of which it is, right? So you're not hitching yourself to one foundation model player. You can be quite flexible, and the end user, the thing that they want and then what they experience is just better outcomes over time. They don't even know necessarily what's under the hood. The infosec and such does need to know, but the end user that's actually doing the particular work, to them it doesn't really matter as long as the application layer continues to get better over time.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed.
How do you think about basically empowering the different users on your team that maybe aren't as enthusiastic about Gen AI, but they are essential to adoption? So maybe let me give you an example. You might have people whose process changes overnight because you've introduced some Gen AI capability. And so, something that you used to do, maybe it's faster, or maybe it's pre-done by generative AI, like taking the pass on the document set or a submission or a particular workflow, to give you an example. And so their role changes and they're a little bit apprehensive around that change, right? Are they going to lose their job? What does it mean for kind of their career longer term? How do you handle those
Yeah.
types of fears, and how do you make sure they are not blockers to improvement within the organization? Maybe even if it's reluctant at first, are more likely adopting the new technology and using it to make not only their productivity better, but their lives better, and then adding to the win for the organization at large.
Yeah, I mean, I think your question kind of points to something that I have in the digital revolution. I've had, and maybe it's the Gen Xer in me, but I've had my own thinking around when do we force features down someone's throat versus when do we say, again, from an empathy and understanding the voice of our customer, what are they happy with and which problems are we trying to solve? I mean, I think if I'm already at a point where I'm trying to push someone to use something that they're resisting, and how do I win them over to the benefits of it? No, it's really better if you just change some things. I feel like that's a that can be sort of a fundamentally flawed outlook. If they're struggling, if they aren't able to be productive or aren't able to respond to something, be able to respond to something, and I provide a solution to that problem, and it's just educating them on the nuances of how to achieve their objective, that's an entirely different discussion than you now have Gen AI and you're expected to just use it to do your job. And I would almost never lead with that unless I will never say never. I would almost never, but I don't want to say never. But I have a hard time imagining when I would lead with that rather than who's hungry for it and who wants to be at the tip of the spear to really show the rest of the org what it means to be innovative with purpose and have a clear value target and then exceed that value realization. To me, that's the story I want to go after, especially in the early days. The last thing I want to do is try and find random populations and go, voila, you're Gen AI now, and have all of them revolt and demand my head on a spear.
I completely agree. It's funny you say that because I think that that was a discovery that we made along the way, building multimodal, right? Figuring out
Yep.
which companies and which teams are open to this technology and what it could do for the work that they do day in day out, and the teams that have been open and eager, and then we've been able to show how much their life improves, like their work life truly improves because they're very valuable to the organization. They're very well trained. They get to do more complex work that is more enriching to their lives. They've been really incredible at adopting the technology because they realize the technology is doing the things that they don't want to be doing anyways. And so they aren't looking at it as a
Yep.
point of fear or apprehension. They're actually asking for it. They're clamoring for it. And then if you know there are occasions where maybe the teams just organizationally are more fearful and there's resistance and sometimes those are the wrong ones to target because you want to show that like you said, George, you want to go to the team that's pulling it, that is more clamoring for it, eager to adopt it, and then you make them successful and you show to the other teams that have that reluctance. Look at the team on the other side of the road, what they've done, what they've seen, right? They're more valuable to the organization. They actually have more productivity gains, are happier with the work that they do, with the Gen AI taking on some of the smaller tasks that they weren't fond of in the first place. And so it becomes this huge success
Hmm.
story that opens up more opportunities for generative AI, right? Across the organizations. I think sequencing this, right, finding the right order of operations is absolutely critical to making sure generative AI adoption is successful within the organization.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, George, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. And thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. Where can people find more information about you personally as well as your organization? We'll make sure to include that in the show notes.
I'm my LinkedIn. I welcome engagement through LinkedIn. I'm usually checking there most frequently. Um, and then I pop up in different forums. I'd say I participate a lot with the Dataversity group, as well as through the EW Solutions group, and then certainly with Multimodal as we're kind of on the journey together to continue to see what the future looks like. So those are probably the best areas to find me. Otherwise, if you're looking at my resume and which company I'm at, happy to talk shop with anyone that's in a similar field. So network away.
And George, you're really active and vocal on LinkedIn. I think it's phenomenal. I think the LinkedIn community is better off for it. And certainly it's been a pleasure having you on our advisory board. So thanks for everything. Thanks for being on the show. And look forward to having this conversation again in a year or two from now to see where things are. But thanks for the chat today, and we look forward to seeing you again on the show in the future.
Thanks so much, Ankur. Take care.